So one of the sentences of literary criticism that has settled most deeply in my mind, not particularly for its grace, although it's graceful enough, but for its thought, is one from Terence Cave's cornucopian text. He writes, "In imitation, indeed, the activities of reading and writing become virtually identified." And he's writing in that book about an Erasmian rhetorical culture where students read with a commonplace book next to them, where they're covetous of the style of their subjects. They're really reading as makers and experimenting all the time in the voices of others and with making their own voices. And I don't want to take an entirely nostalgic view of that. Attention to texts under the tuition of a 16th century schoolmaster was much more philological than interpretive or critical, certainly in any Frankfurt or ideological sense of critique that we use. And I don't think any of us has any great desire to return to that alone. But I think this virtual identification of reading and writing is something that we have lost, and something that we've lost relatively recently, that these are activities that in ways we don't always recognize are more cut off from each other than they used to be, or if not, the traffic between them is more covert and less considered than it might be. And so I want to use my 10, 15 minutes here to talk about some possible terms for their reunion. And I think this has implications for how we teach literature and how we understand the techniques and the objects of literary study. So I'll start with a few pedagogical examples. The first from my first year of teaching, when I set up one of those courses that you fill with texts that you're intrigued by but haven't actually read or have read once or twice before. And it was a course called Poem versus Novel on hybrids of these two forms in the 20th century. And I put some things on there that I've come to love, like Virginia Woolf's The Waves or Anne Carson's autobiography of Red. But the great headache came from assigning John Ashbery's The System, one of the three prose poems that are sort of in the middle of his career, I guess now the early middle of his career as it goes on. But it's a poem that absolutely defies close reading, and as I got closer and closer to actually putting it in front of my freshmen, I got increasingly desperate. And in my desperation, what I tried was to say, how about if you guys come to class with a paragraph of this long thing inserted anywhere you like, a paragraph of your own, but which I ought not to be able to distinguish from a paragraph of Ashbery's. And I'll give you just a sentence of Ashbery's if you don't know the poem or if you want the reminiscence of it. What was wanted and what was precisely lacking in this gay and salubrious desert was an end to the end theory whereby each man was both an idol and the humblest of idolaters. In other words, the antipodes of his own universe, his own redemption or his own damnation, with the rest of the world as a painted backdrop to his own monodrama of becoming, of which he was the lone impassioned spectator. Now, you can interpret the hell out of that thing, but it's not exactly the point. What you really want to get is some sense of its habit of self-qualification, the way in which these dependent clauses buoy it up until finally you get to the end of a kind of half nod, sort of deferential period. And Ashbery, in writing sentences like this, defining these middle moods in which so much of his poetry takes place, neither despairing nor ecstatic, protecting himself from emotional extremes, protecting himself by mechanisms of syntax. And that was something that I would never have seen, I think we would never have seen, if we hadn't tried it ourselves. But working our way into the motion of those sentences, that motive behind them became manifest. My next experiment in this vein was much more concerted, a junior seminar on style. I thought, this worked pretty well. Let's see how far we can take it. And that was a course that worked backwards from Woolf and Gertrude Stein to the King James Bible week by week, with the assignment each week being, again, kind of write a page of perfect counterfeit. I want you to sound like Gertrude Stein. Above all, don't sound like yourself. Sound like somebody else. And accompany that page with another page of analysis. And one of the projects of the course was to accumulate a technical vocabulary for describing prose. We leaned heavily on Richard Lanham and Virginia Tufte, who provide a lot of resource in that regard. And then conclude that paragraph of analysis with an account of what you want from this prose. That is, what are you going to steal from Gertrude Stein for your own writing? What do you covet here? And they're really very good at it. I think there was not a student in the class who couldn't produce, 2 or 3 sentences together, at least, where you thought, that is Samuel Johnson. Students who couldn't place a comma properly in their own prose, could never remember to close off that parenthetical phrase. And yet, in a different relation to text, as an imitator, they could get the sound of Johnson in their heads and know that the comma was one of the ways that sound was made. And suddenly they became much more versatile and capable writers. I feel like I have a lot of thinking and experimenting to do left, thinking about how to plow that back into their own writing, in their own voice. But it seems enormously promising to me. You wouldn't think you could do that with grad students, right? Grad students, much too sophisticated, cynical, professional, et cetera, to submit themselves to imitation, but it's not true. I taught a course on Renaissance lyric. Next year now I've taught it a couple of times. And again, each week you've got to come in with a few lines of Wyatt to start. And as you go along, you get into exercise very much sort of drawn out of an Erasmian repertory of, for example, taking 4 lines of Fulk Greville and rewriting them in the style of Walter Raleigh, and then taking 4 lines of Walter Raleigh and rewriting them in the style of Fulk Greville. And that's an entirely absorbing and fascinating thing to do. We also studied the descriptive vocabulary, again, both drawn from Renaissance rhetorical manuals and also from contemporary analytic models. I asked them to come in every time, and this was a source of fun and enlightenment, both with the best and the worst lines that they had encountered in the course of that reading, on the assumption that anybody who was reading these sonnets in the period was reading them covetously. What can I get out of this? What do I want from my own writing, my own sonnets from this? And to try to put them into some similar relation to it themselves. They were really good at it. And I think the lesson of that for me is that we are really good at it. We're just good imitators, as Aristotle would tell us. It's not a facility we always exercise with great concertedness or deliberation, but it turns out that if we do, we have a talent. So, so far I'm describing a way into literary text. I think there's some relation to what Francis was saying in terms of just contemporaneity. That is, you're putting yourself you're making yourself a contemporary of the text that you imitate in some sense. Getting a feel for the craft, the making, for the choices of that making. You're giving yourself matter for interpretation, the way that I described with Ashbery. But I don't think the activity is entirely subordinated to interpretation. It's a way of knowing in itself. I think a valuable literary way of knowing, a teachable way of knowing. And of course, in ways that we might talk about, it's not exactly what's going on in creative writing departments, where models are not necessarily to the fore. But I think these practices are just as valuable, and here I'm to have Deirdre's remarks in mind as well, not just as valuable as a way into criticism, the art of criticism, because we still, we spend so much energy teaching our students close reading, these sorts of idealized, step-by-step exegetical encounters with texts. And then we ask them to transcribe those, or write the transcription of the imaginary order in which that encounter occurred. But we don't really teach them much about essay making. And grad students often come to us still producing these close narratives of reading, these sorts of commentaries. I'm reminded of being in a seminar with Marge Garber, whenever it was, 10 years ago, and you said something about commentary and close reading as an activity that you loved, but you'd gotten tired of reading it. And I was scandalized by that, but I've come to agree entirely. And I think that, that that sort of progression is one that could have been hastened by my teachers if there'd been more attention to the kind of rhythm of seduction and of argument making that's characteristic of a good essay. We don't tend to give students essays as examples or encourage them to observe them, again, in that kind of covetous way. What's the rhythm of a good argument? It's, again, sort of generalization. It's rise and dip, generality and particularity. And I think in doing that less than we don't debilitate the imitative impulse. It's always with us. It's just that it's unconsidered. So we have half imitations. We have often writing that sounds like someone's style rather than learning how to use that style. I think that's a particular affliction, as we've all encountered with the teaching of theory, students who get very good at sounding like this or that theoretical idiom, but not so good at using it to make arguments. One other example of this kind of thing, I guess, briefly, in another forum, a friend of mine and I, a historian of science, have been organizing a series of workshops or events with Cabinet Magazine, which has a performance space in New York, and we do them around a different dead poet every month or so. We did one, for example, on Sappho, and we had people come in. We'd inscribed Sappho's poems on clay tablets. The fragments, we broke those fragments themselves into fragments, passed them around, had people try to reassemble them. And then at the end of the evening, after a reading of some of the poems, we had them set those fragments on a big sheet of butcher paper with a grease pencil and try to make the poem that might have housed that fragment of language. And there was a little bit of a sense in the audience, and we had 50 or 60 people turn out for this. Oh God, I thought I was going to get to sit here and listen. You're going to make me do something? But they loved it. And having that kind of makerly relationship to writing is a very exciting thing. And it's not, it's not merely a classroom phenomenon, but it can travel well. We teach interpretation, we teach argument. We do this under a general umbrella, often of critique, uncovering what is hidden or not obvious. That implies some distance from the object of our study, some critical distance, but I think that the dominance of that assumption wants some rethinking. We do well to think of our students and of ourselves as makers, and of their writing and our writing, not just as proof of our understanding, but as a contribution, however minor, honorably minor, I think, to the world of good writing that we study. And I think this is easy to put, and there are lots of people talking now about alternatives to critique or limits to critique, but I still think it's a pretty big shift in terms of practices, or runs against a pretty strong current in the practices that predominate among us. Even that phrase, critical thinking, which we've heard a lot today and use a lot, above all, right, this is what the humanities are supposed to teach. And I certainly believe in it too, but I wonder if we lean on it too much, and what else there is: making, productive sympathy, creative imitation, appreciation, celebration. These may be things that we have to learn too, engaging imitation alongside method as a pedagogical resource. And I'll just say finally that there may be in this approach an alternative account, or grounds for an alternative account, of what we should read and why we should read it. That literary studies has a special, not exclusive, but special and maybe even constitutive occupation with texts that are worth imitating, texts that we want not just to understand, but to become. And if that's what we want from reading, I think it will have an effect on what we read. Thanks.